I'm Enrique Cerna at Mohai, the Museum of History and Industry. Coming up, a special community conversation as we mark the centennial of the armistice that ended World War I. We're going to hear from a panel of Puget Sound area thought leaders about the past and its influence today in a conversation called New World Order, the geopolitics of disruption and change. Coming up next. Hello and welcome to Mohai, the Museum of History and Industry here on South Lake Union. I'm Enrique Cerna, very pleased to have you with us. We're here for an important conversation that we call New World Order, the geopolitics of disruption and change. This conversation coincides with the centennial of the armistice that ended World War I and Mohai's World War I America traveling exhibit that opened in September. So what is the connection of this history to the present and the future? Well, for that, I'm going to bring in Leonard Garfield. He's the executive director of Mohai. And Leonard, we've been working on this for quite a while. Tell me how this came about and why it's important.
Well, you know, we've worked for about 10 years. We recognized that World War I seemed like a history that was lost. So few people remembered it. And yet it laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. We wanted to bring that to light because so many of the issues we grapple with now were shaped by events 100 years ago.
And as I mentioned, the World War I America exhibit is here. The connection and the importance of understanding that history.
Well, that's so true. Thousands of people from Washington State served. Hundreds from King County lost their lives. But as importantly, the city changed. Our region changed. You know, Boeing was just a thought. After World War I, it was a major industry. Shipbuilding, forest products. It all came to fruition during World War I. And the complexion of our community changed. New people came in. We became more diverse. The groundwork for issues about labor rights were brought to the forefront during World War I. All of these issues that we still deal with, we have a lot to learn from 100 years ago.
And that's why we're here tonight. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Now, earlier I sat down with former Governor, Commerce Secretary, and Ambassador to China, Gary Locke, to get his insights on America's role in the world, trade, China, and the state of our democracy. So these are tumultuous times in so many ways. Do you see a new world order where America is no longer at the top and is losing its influence and its impact globally?
Well, I'm very worried about the direction of America and our foreign policy and the consequences to our prestige, our stature in the world. Obviously, countries all around the world are still looking up to us. But there are other countries competing for the attention of many other countries, developing countries, and even some of our traditional allies, and that's of concern to me. I think, obviously, America's influence is fading or at least being lessened, and partially because of our own fault, but also because of the emergence and the increased activity and attention that other countries are giving to world affairs.
So after World War I and through the 20th century, it seems that America set the international agenda based on global capitalism and trade and imposing its influence on democratic systems throughout the world. But then came the rise of China, and you know this well. How do you see China's influence in our global politics in this century?
Well, you're going to see China continuing to rise in influence and stature, but also many other countries around the world. But over the last several decades, over Democratic and Republican administrations and Democratic and Republican Congresses, the amount that we've given to foreign aid has decreased dramatically. And therefore, other countries have stepped into the breach, and they have therefore begun to cultivate those political and cultural people-to-people ties.
So the Trump administration has been imposing tariffs on China, and we have this trade war now going on. You're concerned about the long-term impact of that trade war.
In a trade war, there are no winners. Certainly American companies, foreign companies, American government, foreign governments have very deep concerns about the trade investment policies of China. The fact that in order to do business in China, you have to have oftentimes a partner And when you have that partner, you have to share intellectual property. The fact that there's blatant theft of intellectual property in China. These are all legitimate concerns, but imposing tariffs on each other's goods and services and products ultimately hurts the consumers of both countries and the workers of both countries. I think there are different ways by which we can more effectively try to achieve our goals and address our concerns. We have to do it in concert with other countries. Just as, for instance, if Microsoft or Amazon have to have a partner in China in order to offer cloud computing services, why don't we impose the same restrictions on some of their companies that do work in the United States, have a level playing field? So the tariffs will simply raise the price of so many of the consumer goods that American companies, and in fact components that American companies use in their own manufacturing as they make their products. That's going to raise the price of goods for American consumers, whether it's at Nordstrom or Walmart or Target or Home Depot. It's also going to raise the cost of inputs that American companies use when they make stuff, which they then try to sell overseas. That raises the price of their goods. It's going to hurt American workers. It's going to hurt American companies. It's going to hurt American consumers. There are many other ways in which we could try to address those issues without having a trade war.
Do you think that China will be at the top of the New World Order in the 21st century?
I think America will still be at the top. People still look to America as the symbol of freedom, hope, and opportunity, as a country of innovation, and that's because perhaps of our great diversity of people. We welcome people from around the world, generation after generation of new people bringing new ideas, perspectives, and really pushing our country forward. So I think we're going to continue to be very, very innovative. We're going to be economically strong. Will we be the only country? No. China and many other countries in Europe as well as in Asia want to be world leaders, class leaders in terms of technology and scientific discovery, space exploration. So we're going to have a lot of challenges, but I think that's also good for America.
Let's talk about trade. What appears to be a changing attitude toward free trade, especially with the rise of nationalist politics in Europe and elsewhere. So what do you think is going to be the impact on our global politics and also global trade?
I think that's a very dangerous trend, to insist that everything that you buy in your own country has to be made in your own country. That's going to really result in a balkanization and isolation of every country. And that's actually going to hurt Americans more. Because, for instance, almost 1/3 of all the soybeans grown by American farmers are exported overseas. So if we start saying, if the Chinese people say, no, we're only going to buy our soybeans grown in China, then that's going to hurt the farmers of America. If China says, we're only going to buy high-tech products made in China, that's going to hurt a lot of our high-tech companies that build the chips and everything else that are going over to China, that's being transformed and remanufactured into advanced manufacturing goods.
So what's your biggest concern about the state of our democracy?
It's the fact that we don't have a really strong press and people aren't really getting their information. So we need a strong, free press that is respected, that is willing to expose the weaknesses and the foibles and the shortcomings of the left and the right, Democratic and Republican. But we need a highly educated and involved citizenry, because only then can we really start debating and figuring out solutions to some of the pressing issues facing our country, the role of America in the world, the advent of technology and what that will do to jobs in the next 10, 15 years, climate change and everything else, or just trade. Does trade really benefit us? How can we make trade policies better to make sure that workers who are affected are getting the job training and the retraining or the assistance that they need to maintain a family wage job to support their own families? We need good information so that we can debate these issues and hopefully move forward.
We are joined now by a panel of what we call thought leaders from our community, some folks that have incredible backgrounds. Grethe Cammermeyer is a retired Army colonel and a nurse. She served in Germany and Vietnam. In 1988, as part of her military security clearance, she disclosed that she was a lesbian, resulting in the termination of her 25-year military career. She challenged her discharge in federal court, won, and was reinstated. Her story became a made-for-television movie, Serving in Silence. She was played by Glenn Close. Bill Center is a retired Navy Rear Admiral. He served for 35 years. Among his many duties, he was a senior advisor to General Colin Powell and the Joint Chiefs of Staff on arms control, nonproliferation, environmental matters, and international agreements. Daniel Chirot is the Herbert J. Ellison Professor of International Studies at the University of Washington's Jackson School. He's authored books about social change, ethnic conflict, genocides, Eastern Europe, and tyranny. And Denis Hayes is the president of the Bullitt Foundation. In 1970, he rose to prominence as the coordinator for the first Earth Day. In 1999, Time magazine named him a hero of the planet. They're all a bunch of overachievers, don't you think? Here we go. Let me begin with you, Grethe Cammermeyer. As we take on this issue and this kind of weighty topic, I'd just like to get actually all of you to weigh in at this, on this too. But Grethe, I'm going to start with you, and that is, in looking at parallels from World War I to where we are today, what are your thoughts about that? What parallels do you see?
I think probably the greatest change is what has happened for the role of women in society as well as in the military. And because we're talking about the centennial anniversary of the end of World War I think it's important to recognize that women served in the military, sometimes being recognized for their efforts and other times not. There's a group of 233 women who were the original sort of signal corps. They were hired to transmit information from General Pershing's headquarters to the front lines and lived with the troops for the duration of the war. And it's because of their efforts that President Wilson changed his mind about women's suffrage. And so because of their efforts, we have the right to vote. And it's really quite extraordinary. And the parallel would be, I think, that women have just been sort of authorized to serve in combat, as though we haven't even since the Revolutionary War. We now have women who are Marines in the infantry and are able to serve in combat officially, even though for the past 15 years they have served embedded. They couldn't have the recognition nor being able to be competitive for promotion to a higher rank because theoretically they were not supposed to serve in combat. But that has been changed through the efforts of women serving in those capacities. And so it's if you can do the job, you should be able to do the job. And I think there's a recognition now that women can do every bit as well a job, and my bias would be, if not better, than the men that they serve adjacent to.
Well, of course, General Pershing thought that women could do well, and that's why actually they were known as the Hello Girls. And there's actually now an off-Broadway play being created about their background. Yeah. So, Bill Center, your thoughts on this?
Yes, sir. Well, I certainly agree with everything Grethe had to say. The progress, the recognition of the capability and the skills and the talents that women bring to the table that has changed over the last 100 years has really been fantastic. When I look at the parallels between World War I and the present, one of the things that comes to mind is the leaders at the time, back in 1914, didn't appreciate how fast things were changing. And I think the same is very much true today. We naturally, as human beings, expect the next 10 years will be pretty much like the 10 years we've just passed. And so we expect there'll be a lot of change. But in fact, the next 10 years, we're going to see 10 times as much change as we saw in the last 10 years. We're on an exponential curve here. And I think it's very difficult, just as it was for the leaders in 1914, to grasp what the war was actually going to be like, because they were looking backward. For leaders today to grasp what any kind of global conflict would be like in the future. We're facing a time where technology is going to give us the capability, give even non-nation states the capability to conduct strikes halfway around the world using drones, artificial intelligence, the technologies that we have. We'll see disruptions in space, disruptions to things like GPS. We'll see non-nation state actors and nation state actors interfering in the internet, as we've recently experienced with the election process, in ways that will disrupt the conflict, possibly try to involve the combatants in battles that wouldn't otherwise have been engaged in, just because they've been misled by the information that's available. And I don't think we're adequately preparing for this. We're still very worried about things like missile attacks, and I think it's appropriate. But we don't have much defense against swarms of drones flying in, or maybe even taking off from the back of a U-Haul right within our own country. It's going to be a whole different war. Civilian populations are going to be held at risk. It causes me a lot of concern. I don't have a remedy for it because we're slow. We're slow learners. We study history, but we don't always learn the right lessons.
Daniel Chirot, I think I've heard that from you before in talking our conversation that we had before this, about the past and learning from it.
Well, if you look at the history of World War I, you can draw two kinds of lessons. One that I'm sure you've heard is sort of an analogy. There was a dominant empire that had been the dominant country in the world for close to a century. That was Great Britain. There was a rising power that was actually advancing faster, and that was challenging it, and that was Germany. There was a really badly fading empire that was causing a lot of trouble because of its ethnic problems and wars on its borders, and that was Austria-Hungary. And there was a giant Russia that was ruled by an idiot who called himself an absolute monarch, and he was. And so you could look at that today and say, and many have, well, Great Britain, the United States, Germany, China. I haven't heard so much Austria-Hungary, Russia, but Russia is a fading country. Its demography is in terrible shape, its economy is in bad shape, but yet it can create a lot of problems and is allied in a way with China. And a sort of a cheap analogy would be, well, here we go again. Now, I think that's somewhat misleading. It is a different world. There were no nuclear bombs then. And the world isn't exactly the same, though it's a provocative analogy. Now, the other thing that you can draw from it is what happens when, in critical times, important countries are led by people who are foolish. They can be foolish for a number of reasons, because of their ideology. They don't necessarily need to be stupid, but they can badly misjudge things. Or, like the Tsar in Russia, or the Kaiser in Germany, they were fools. Not everyone was a fool. The leadership in Austria-Hungary was also. And the thing to learn from that is not to try to draw an analogy, but to say, when you, in a critical situation, have many leaders who, for one reason or another, are really not very capable, the disasters they cause impact millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, and the mistakes they make and the disasters they bring on us never get fixed. We can say, yes, in the end, everything worked out. Well, not for the over 10 million who were killed in World War I, not of the 100 million who were killed in World War II, which was a result of World War I, not as a result of communism in the Soviet Union, which wouldn't have happened without World War I. And so we have to remember that the mistakes being made have repercussions that we may never get over. One last thought. Maybe no one else here is going to quote Lenin. I'll quote Lenin. In 1913, when the Romanov dynasty in Russia celebrated its 300th anniversary, Lenin, who was in exile in Switzerland, was very depressed, and he wrote to a friend, "They're going to rule for another 300 years, unless Franz Ferdinand, the Emperor of Austria, and Nikolasha, which was the nickname for Nikolai II, are stupid enough to get into a war. That would be good for revolution." And who knew what was going to happen? If anyone had known what was going to happen, it wouldn't have happened, but they didn't know.
Denis Hayes.
Well, I have to confess that when Dan began making his comparisons and had a nation that was led by an idiot, I thought he was going someplace else for the comparison. To try to deal with that period versus this period, I think they're just a little bit notched separate. That's to say, a few years distinct. Looking at national leaders, Woodrow Wilson was in a great many ways like Barack Obama, relatively tall, relatively skinny, very academic, spoke in learned phrases, idealist, both won a Nobel Peace Prize, probably to be somewhat controversial, probably neither of them should have won a Nobel Peace Prize. But in many ways, we're very much alike. And the period that Obama presided over, coming out of the meltdown of the financials that followed the collapse of Lehman Brothers, that turned out to be a V recession. It went down very abruptly, came up very abruptly. And then we had now what has been the longest bull market in the history of the stock market in the United States, the longest bull market with no interruptions in it. That is very akin to the Roaring Twenties, which came out of World War I. This country was in World War I only in the very latest stages, but in the process of that really geared up our economy. And because of the ways that the German reparations were made, which may be something that we'll be getting into later, but then the Dawes Act, how we got back from Great Britain and from France, some of the loans that we've made for them, it created an economy that just roared. If in fact you want to push that to the next stage, then the scary thing is that we may now be coming out of the Roaring Twenties and into that worst part of the interwar period, the Great Depression of 1929, when the stock market collapses overnight but doesn't come right back up the next year, but rather stretches out for a very long period of time, brings about a great deal of very beneficial social reconstruction in the United States, the New Deal, but doesn't really, once again, get itself on a full-blown economic vitality until the advent of World War II, where once again, of course, we didn't get into it in the early days, but our economy got into it in the early days and prospered through it. So if I was really looking for an analogy here that scares me, it's not between 1918 and 2018, it's between 1929 and 2019.
That's sobering. Well, let me ask you this. I asked this of former Ambassador Locke. In the state of our democracy today, I'm curious as to how you guys see this. Bill Center, someone who spent so many years in the military and also did a lot of work also on a diplomatic level.
Well, thank you. I see a couple of challenges. When I talk to my students, I've been teaching at the university for the last 15 years, and I've taught a lot of international students, and they have a lot of questions about our democracy. And the biggest challenge I pointed out to them was we've become very cynical in this country. One of my favorite philosophers, Lily Tomlin, said these days, no matter how cynical you become, it's difficult to keep up. And cynicism is not good for democracy. We have to believe. We have to have faith. And I think we have to fight cynicism on the individual level every day. And we become cynical about the press. And even more concerning to me, we become cynical about expertise in general. Scientific expertise, intellectual expertise of all sorts, references to the deep state. And over the years, my experience working in government, I never met anybody that wasn't working their tail off to do the best possible job for the U.S. taxpayer. And I never met experts in any field who just were not at the top of their field and really represented the best knowledge. And when you go to do something like a nuclear arms control agreement, like an environmental agreement, like a trade agreement, which is even more complicated than nuclear weapons, you need people that know what they're doing. And we've just cavalierly cast these people aside. You know, we've lost our experts in so many areas in the State Department, even in the intelligence community. And so it's really easy to point the finger when you're trying to find the problems of democracy, but I think the fingers end up pointing back at ourselves. We become cynical and we become dismissive of the bureaucracy, about some of the really important glue that holds our government institutions together. And even to the point, probably the most dismaying figure to come out of the recent election was that among the electorate 18 to 29-year-old, only 13% participation level. That's very disheartening. We've got to restore faith among our young voters. We've got to get them energized. We've got to get them to participate, because you can't have democracy when half the electorate's sitting on the sideline.
Can I jump in on that, Enrique? I agree entirely with Bill, as always seems to be the case, but would take it one step further. When we say in this country democracy, we are not just talking about what that word actually means in the dictionary, that the likelihood that a slight majority of the people are likely to be more right than wrong a majority of the time. I mean, Duterte was elected in a democracy. Erdogan was elected in a democracy. Donald Trump was elected in a democracy. Hitler was elected in a democracy. It's this combination of a solid constitution and a Bill of Rights and the rule of law and the separation of the powers and that entire piece of complex machinery that has defined what for a very long time has made America a bastion of creativity and stability and inspiration to the world. But you really need to have the whole picture of which democracy is a part.
Are you cynical, Grethe Cammermeyer, about our state of the democracy?
I am frightened. I'm frightened by cyber attacks, not knowing whether or not somebody else is going to drive off with my car, with me in it and not having any control, and feeling that nobody is watching the hen house. And that's because nobody is in charge that isn't just knee-jerking to something that is personally offensive to him, like truth. And that to me is a frightening state of affairs. I think also that having served in war, having cared for casualties, to have the idea that there's going to be fury and we're going to take you out if you don't do what I say. I mean, there's sort of a glib way of talking about the risk of war for someone who has never served, has never had any of his family serve, but are willing to put other people in harm's way. And in Vietnam, there was more and more dissension at home. And those of us serving during that time were feeling that we were being attacked personally, just like the press is today, but attacked personally for doing what we had been sent to do in terms of defending the country and the democracy and keeping the domino effect from taking place in the Far East. And so there was this sort of sense that certainly the people who sent us there had to know what they were doing, and that the reason we were there was because there was just stuff that we didn't know, and it was for the best. And when McNamara's book came out, it was sort of that validation of, we've got idiots sending people to war just for their ego, and that is just absolutely, obnoxious. And, what are we doing today that is different from then? Sending people to war for egos, for, being the tough bully around in the country. And that frightens me also. An election in a democracy that really moves the pendulum in my direction makes it feel as though maybe we'll get some control back instead of having just this voice of untruths leading the country and the world. But I have belief.
Yeah. Daniel Chirot.
Well, 25 years ago, there was a great deal of optimism. Communism had failed. There was going to be democracy everywhere. China was rising, but China was friendly. And it's surprising how quickly that turned out to not be the case. Democracy is in trouble all over the world. From Brazil, China, which had been moving toward a more liberal society, is moving very rapidly in the other direction, with large concentration camps for their Uyghur population, and really the reestablishment of a totalitarian society, but with much better electronics than before, so they can watch people better. But in Europe, the original home of democratic Europe, in France, in Great Britain, it's not just in the United States that there's a loss of faith. There's a complete loss of faith in government in Italy. And these are other countries many Americans don't know that much about, but it is a worldwide problem. Am I cynical? Absolutely. And it's not because I really want to be, but 25 years ago, as a specialist on Russia and the Soviet Union, I was very optimistic about what was going to happen. And it hasn't happened. Whose fault is it? Well, it's too complicated to say. It's many people's fault. We've had bad leadership. There's been bad leadership elsewhere. The recession and financial crisis that started here, wasn't handled very well. Can things be remedied? Yes, we've had problems before. The last time this country was as divided as it is now was in the 1850s. Oh, I forgot, there was a civil war after that. So, but things can be fixed, and you're absolutely right that it's bad to have young people who are cynical. It's bad to not have young people participate. And things have to change here in Europe and elsewhere, and I hope they will.
One thing that seemed like in the run-up to the election here, we weren't hearing much about Russia and their involvement in our last election. Everything seemed to be around caravans and invasions and other things. Is Russia still a concern for us as it was, in affecting our elections and so on? This is a specialty of yours.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've all read about Russian interference in the election. There have been good studies, and they did affect the 2016 election. I'm not sure they got exactly what they bargained for. But Russia is a destructive power, and it's much weaker than the Soviet Union was. Yes, they have nuclear bombs, but I don't think even they want to start a nuclear war. But they're a troublemaker, and Putin is certainly not an idiot. He's tactically very smart and strategically very dumb. What he's doing is hurting his country, preventing it from economic reform. Russia is in serious demographic decline, and if it gets desperate enough, it could start the kind of problem that Austria-Hungary did in a similar situation in 1914 and involve the rest of the world in some really terrible things.
You know, one thing that we are becoming more and more concerned about, and there seems to be great debate about as well, is climate change. And how do you see this, Denis Hayes? You know, it's enough to worry about the environment and things getting, our weather changing so much, but what does this mean to our national security from your perspective?
Happy to dig in. A thought just occurred to me that had not occurred to me before when Dan was talking, that might as well get out because it might be the sort of thing that will provoke someone in the audience. The Russian invasion of the Crimea basically met by nothing except the Ukraine trying without any success to repel it, may bear some kind of relationship to the invasion of the Sudetenland and Neville Chamberlain and the decision of the great powers not to push back on that. There is something about having a bully who gets a few easy marks that then make him think we can keep on going, and you can stumble into some gigantic mistakes. And those mistakes today, and this does edge toward climate change now, unlike in World War II, can lead to tipping points that are irreversible. I mean, with a thermonuclear exchange, followed by nuclear winter, followed by vast areas of contamination that will endure for centuries, is something that, I mean, losing 100 million people is a catastrophe. Losing a third of a continent for the next 300 years goes to a different level. And so with regard to climate, that's the place where we know that there are tipping points. We don't know where they are, and we know that none of them are good. So there's going to be some point where the methane hydrates begin to bubble off from the seas, and suddenly methane, which in the short run has 85 times the global warming forcing power of carbon dioxide, begins to heat things up faster, causing more methane hydrates to bubble up, and it becomes self-reinforcing. It's the same sort of thing as ice melts, and suddenly the sun is heating up the ocean more because it's falling onto dark water, not onto bright ice, which is reflecting the sunlight. So that speeds it up, and it becomes self-reinforcing. And you can see it with regard to the forest fires in California right now. You can see it with regard to droughts. The dry zone in the Midwest, where the breadbasket, certainly of the country, and to some great extent still the breadbasket of the world, which was at one point, of course, the Dust Bowl, that dry area has now moved 150 miles east. And you can say, hey, that doesn't exist. That's just fake news. But the science on it is now so far beyond that that only, if you'll pardon me, an idiot head of state would make that kind of a claim. We find ourselves, and again, being honest but also provocative, in a situation where it is in the strong financial interests of enormously powerful institutions to push further and further in that direction. What we've seen in the last, basically the post-Keynesian period, is that neoliberal economics has become public policy. Public policy in that realm says that price signals are all. If you want to get things right on climate, then you have to charge for greenhouse gas emissions in ways that internalize the costs of what they are doing to the planet. If you step back for a second, if what they're doing to the planet is permanently impoverishing it and lowering its productive capacity for people and all other things in perpetuity, it's pretty difficult to put a price on that. My sense is that it's more than 15 cents a gallon for gasoline. And yet, when that relatively modest effort was made in the state of Washington in this last election, the oil industry rose up en masse, with one exception, Shell. And they deserve kudos. I will never buy gasoline from anybody but Shell in the state of Washington in perpetuity. An easy claim because I have an electric car that is entirely fed off of my roof. But should I have one, and there's 2 Shell stations between my house and my office, it would be very easy, as it is for all of you, and I would never buy BP. This is an industry that is doing everything that it can to try to get as much fuel out of the ground as fast as it can, because it knows that there's a point where that fuel is not going to be extracted anymore. The current estimates at today's prices of the fossil fuels that must be left in the ground if the last IPCC's report for what kinds of greenhouse gas emissions are possible before you hit the worst of those first tipping points are correct, is that you need to leave $35 trillion in the ground. You do not have the personality profile that will cause you to become the CEO of an oil company if you can blithely think about leaving $35 trillion in the ground. That's not who gets into those positions. And so we find ourselves in this, just to wrap up that little, we saw ads that are saying that if you pass 1631, that pollution will increase, that the major polluters will be grandfathered, and that poor people will be suffering disproportionately. On the side that's making that ad is every major oil company that operates in the state except Shell, and the Western States Petroleum Association, constituting 95% of the money for those positions. The people that were contradicting that are Bill Gates, Microsoft, the biggest contributor, the Nature Conservancy, and the backing of every environmental group and virtually every social justice group in the state. And yet, $31 million got enough people to vote down this one modest little effort to put a price on carbon. That makes it a little bit bleak.
Yeah, not exactly uplifting. I got to do that. Go ahead.
I'd like to comment on the national security aspect. A lot is made of the fact that scientists overwhelmingly recognize that global climate change is real, it's happening, and that the results, the effects are already obvious. And I don't think often enough we hear that many people that wouldn't classify themselves as scientists are demonstrably on board with that. The Department of Defense of the United States of America got on board with that in the late 80s. And by the time I was working for General Powell and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman and the entire body of the Joint Chiefs of Staff recognized that climate change was in fact a national security threat to our country. The Secretary of Defense and the entire defense establishment became eager to get into full compliance not only with the NEPA, but as we went down the road, you'll see today, even today, the Department of Defense is doing everything it can to comply with the Paris Accords. These accords aren't perfect, the rules aren't perfect, the goals aren't perfect, the Department of Defense isn't perfect, but they're working hard at it. When I was the Department of Defense Regional Environmental Coordinator here in Region 13, I went to my first meeting with the Washington State Department of Ecology. And after the meeting was over, I was walking down the hall with the director, and we were ahead, and our staffs were following behind, and he leaned over to me, and he said, "I have to tell you this." And he said, "But don't tell anybody I said it." He said, before the meeting, when they were briefing me on this, he said, the Navy here in the state of Washington is working harder to comply than any other regulated body that we have here in the state. And I said, yeah, well, don't tell anybody that either, because it's bad for both of us if it looks like you're going easy on us or if it looks like we're being too good. But we work hard at it because it's important. Global climate change is going to change demographics, it's going to change crops, it's going to change the economy globally in ways that we really can't even forecast because the effects are going to be so dramatic. And as Dennis has alluded to, we know there's a tipping point there, multiple tipping points. We really don't know how close we are, but I'm afraid we're closer than we think.
One thing I want to mention here, for those of you in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, come on up here. I have a microphone. I know how to use it, and I'll be happy to take your question or your comment. And I think I have a person right here, right now. Hold on here. Go ahead. I'll hold the mic.
All right.
Don't ever try to take the mic from me.
Yes, sir. So you've talked about the national security threat posed by climate change. You've said that, okay, we're at a point where it's really dangerous. I'm a climate scientist, not really news to me. My question for you is, climate change and democracy. How does climate change threaten democracy globally?
That's a good question.
Good, Bill. You said democracy, not demography, right?
Yeah.
So I suppose both. One of the clear areas is that is the demographic area, which is to say climate refugees are becoming increasingly common, and you can say that a fair amount of what's been leaving the Middle East and heading into Europe, causing extraordinary pressures on the democracies of Western Europe, are driven because their lands are no longer viable. We're seeing some of that, I think, in people coming from Central America into the United States, and we're going to be seeing more and more of it from the American Southwest coming to places that have more water. I think that most of the growth projections for King County are wrong by a factor of 4 or 5 or 6 for the next 30, 40 years. I'm in a constant debate with people over the adequacy of the Cedar River watershed and the Tolt watershed to meet our needs 30 years from now. I think we are at the time now where we should require all new buildings in the greater Seattle metropolitan area to harvest the rain that falls on their roof and store it in cisterns. You don't have to today change it into potable drinking water, though that's easy to do, and we've done it at the Bullitt Center. Technically easy. It was regulatorily difficult, but we now have a glide path for you for the regulations as well, so you can do that smoothly. But just build the cisterns. It's cheap. It's a concrete room in a part of the building that nobody wants to be with a plastic liner in it. But it's really expensive once you've already got the building there to try and retrofit it. So just require it from now on. Going back to the democracy part of it, I think that where you find democracy most failing is when economies are in tatters. And that tends to happen when there's some kind of a massive unexpected disruption to agriculture, to flooding, to the sorts of things that you see with hurricanes and typhoons, the sorts of things that are the natural offshoots of climate change. And I fear that in all of the nations that are suffering these buffeting blows, they're going to be buffeting blows against the democratic impulse and, I will say, constitutional government and the rule of law and Bill of Rights kinds of concerns as well.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things I found offensive over the past couple of years is that the efforts of the world, the efforts of hundreds of people to deal with issues of climate, deal with issues of nuclear proliferation, can be undermined by one individual. That we don't have a check and balance in a democracy. I mean, I always thought we did, and yet one person can sort of annihilate all of the efforts that have gone forward, so that instead of moving forward to improve things, if that's the issue, that they are just discarded as though someone has a better idea. To me, that would be certainly feels like you're undermining democracy.
I'd like to add one thing. I agree with everything that's been said, but I think that when it comes to democracy, and particularly issues like climate change, it really underscores the need to have an educated electorate. And we aren't going to be able to survive the pace of change in the decades ahead without a much more capable educational system than we have now. A good friend of ours said for many years, when they say our education system is broken, they're wrong. Our education is working exactly the way it was designed back in the 1800s. And we haven't updated it. We're still struggling to get computers into the classroom, and when we have them there, We're still struggling to make sure that teachers know how to properly use the computers as an educational tool. We could do so much better. And an educated electorate is going to ensure that the people who are put into office are capable of dealing with the challenges we face. An uneducated electorate can fall prey to people who have an agenda.
You know, it seems like we've gone, I don't know how long now, but we haven't said the word Trump. And it's obvious that it's been alluded to here. And if you want to say disruption, there's the issue. Have you ever seen anything like this? And I'm just curious as to, I think nobody really knows, okay, if you're in the press these days, particularly with the clashes that have been going on, and by the way, we aren't the enemy of the people, but the thing is that nobody seems to how to react. Everything, this is just such a jumbled situation that we're in. Your thoughts, Daniel?
Well, I think it's a mistake to put too much blame on one person. I'm not saying this because he's my favorite president, but we've been heading in that direction for some time, at least since the 1990s, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. So, yes, I think that the president has made things a lot worse, but there were many things happening that were pushing us in that direction. If you'll give me a couple of minutes, I want to say something about democracy, demography, and climate change. After college, I went to work in West Africa. I was with the Peace Corps more than 50 years ago. And in the last 20 years, I've done quite a bit of consulting work in West Africa, and I've gone back to countries where I'd been before. And the situation is catastrophic, and climate change has a lot to do with it, as does population growth. And it is affecting, as is also happening from the Middle East, democracy in Europe. There's a panic about immigration, but the pressures for migration are so intense in many parts of Africa, and of course in the Middle East as well, but numerically even more in Africa, that it's panicking Europe and threatening democracy there. And it's really tragic. 2 years ago I was in Senegal doing some consulting work for for a foundation called the Open Society Foundation that's financed by Soros. In Hungarian you say Soros, but everyone says Soros, who's a wonderful man who's helped a lot and is vilified everywhere for what he's done. And in Senegal I saw people willing to get in canoes to try to get around Africa to get to Europe. About a fifth of them die on the way, and they're so desperate, and climate change has a direct effect on that. So it's not just in the United States, it really is the whole world, and it affects Europe. It's panicked Europe in a completely unreasonable way, but you can understand in a way they see so many millions of people trying to get there, and they don't think they can handle it. So it all does fit together, and if it affects Europe, it affects the world, it affects us. And this is not a problem that's going to go away. And I have to say, working for the Open Society Foundation, I never met George Soros, but he was the one ultimately who was paying me. This is someone who really needs to be defended, and the way he's attacked now all over is just a scandal.
So part of this reflects the fact that this rise in nationalism. I mean, we alluded to it a little bit with Governor Locke, talking about trade. But we're seeing this throughout Europe, and it is here. It is here now. Dennis, you were going to say something.
I was jumping at an earlier stage when you said, have you seen anything like this before with Trump? And I'm thinking, well, yeah, the Jerry Springer show, but or Berlusconi with the nuclear arsenal, but we haven't seen it in the White House, and that really is new. I have met Chirot, and you're right. A warm, sweet, good guy with all the best intentions. I don't know that I agree with all of his ideas, but I agree with most of his ideals. He really wants to build the kind of world that I'm guessing pretty much everyone in this room wants to see. I'll do just a quick reflection, if I might, Enrique, about the reason why I speak sometimes with a little bit of passion about some of these things. There was a period when I ran America's solar and renewable energy research program, and one of my best friends was a guy named Steve Schneider who lived about 20 miles away, and he ran climate modeling for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. This was at a time when our program in renewable was driven entirely by the desire to get ourselves off of dependence on Middle Eastern oil. That was the entire Carter agenda. This is the era that it is. But Steve and I would go out for walks, long hikes on weekends, and he convinced me that it was beyond dispute, and I should say put together a couple of dinners with colleagues of his from NCAR as well. And there was just, the evidence was overwhelming that climate change was real, that it was warming, that the ice ball, that snowball Earth thesis of it 10 years earlier, totally discredited, and that it had a human fingerprint on it. That was 1979. In 1980, I gave a keynote speech to the American Association for the Advancement of Science about the need to push aggressively on renewables as a response to climate change. That's pushing 40 years ago. America, and I guess increasingly humanity, is a counterpuncher. We respond only after something makes it almost impossible for us not to respond. We sort of, I guess, got past the Lusitania, but not by much. It was that pushed us over into World War I. It was clearly Pearl Harbor that very late in World War II got us to mobilize like no nation has ever mobilized before and pushed us into World War II, but only after Pearl Harbor. The great problem with climate change, and we're in our Pearl Harbor stage now. You take a look at what's going on in Malibu at this moment. Right? Malibu. In 1969, one of the things about Earth Day was they're saying if it can happen in Santa Barbara, it can happen any place. Well, Malibu is Santa Barbara on steroids, and you can't escape this stuff that is now coming with houses that are worth $100 million being turned into cinders. We've hit that point, and we are still not moving. And I don't know, if we're not going to be a counterpuncher anymore, I don't know what we become, but one way or the other, in 2020, this nation has to dramatically change its direction, and hopefully, once again, play the role that we've historically played, of leading the world in the right direction. Not saying you first, Gaston, but we will lead the world into a super efficient, renewably powered society that is drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere instead of putting it in.
Other questions, folks? Come on up here.
Could I make one more quick response to that nationalism question?
Yes, you may.
I think it's a question of our age. I think it's fundamentally important. And if you look at my business card, I have engineer, economist, strategic planner. So I'm putting on my economist hat right now. The economy of our country depends on immigration to a large degree, a degree far beyond what most people understand. If we had to depend just upon native-born Americans, the current birth rate of native-born Americans replacement rate is about, or the birth rate is about 1.9 live birth per woman of childbearing age. That's right at or slightly below the replacement rate. In other words, if we didn't have immigration, we'd be in a state of population decline. You can't grow your economy and decline your population. At least it's not sustainable. That's number one. Number two, I don't want to live in a country that people don't want to live in. I want to live in a country that people want to come to. I want to live in a country that people aspire to come to. And for more than a decade, I've taught international students, and I've asked them time and time again what it is about America. And I ask American students the same question: what are America's core values? And I get answers that are all over the place. But when I ask the international students, what are America's core values? I hear the same three words over and over again: hope, opportunity, and freedom. hope, opportunity, and freedom. That's what makes our country special. And when we snuff that out, there's not going to be any more, in Ronald Reagan's biblical phrase, no more shining light on the hill. This country is about hope, opportunity, and freedom. We depend on immigrants to bring their brilliance, to bring their diversity. And I don't just mean cultural and racial diversity. I mean their diversity and ability to look at problems from a different point of view, a different angle, to look at climate change and say, hey, why don't we try this? Because we need every good idea we can get. And this country was built on immigrants. I will leave you with one final thought. As Veterans Day approaches, I wonder what our Commander-in-Chief has to say to the hundreds of recipients of the Medal of Honor who were not born in the United States of America.
Actually, one thing to note is that I believe a quarter of the people that served in World War I were immigrants. So keep that in mind.
I was wondering, speaking of climate change, what's his name, Barroso in Brazil has talked about industrializing. What's that? Bolsonaro, sorry. That's what I keep her for. I was wondering, he's talking about industrializing the rainforest. What do you make of that? How's that going to impact us?
We have a climate scientist in the first row, but this is one that even I feel comfortable with. It would be an unmitigated catastrophe, no matter what it is that they try to replace it with. The Amazon is one of the great carbon sinks of the world, and simple geometry, when people keep on thinking, well, you cut down the trees and you just plant new ones. But the amount of carbon that you get with a sapling that has a diameter like that versus the amount of carbon you get from a 40-year-old tree that has a diameter like that, they're both growing about that same size of ring, but it's a vastly greater area on a big tree. And slashing down the Amazon would be destroying the lungs of the planet.
How quickly do you think that, how quickly do you think that the impact would be felt?
Oh, the impact would be felt instantly, but I mean, if you were cutting it down instantly, I don't know what the number of square miles we are losing per month in the Amazon is right now, but I know that if you're accelerating at 3, 4, 5, 10 times that rate, you're going to be very aware of that very rapidly.
Question.
Well, we spoke earlier about cynicism, and of course, at this point, it's hard not to be a cynic. But I remember earlier in my life, I grew up overseas in the military. I actually had a much brighter outlook, and part of that, of course, was, I think, from growing up in a world where the government was good, government services. My parents were government service workers, the military. All of that provided a little bit of optimism about what government can do. And granted, it's not perfect, and even as a young child is aware of some of the failings. So the question I have for you is, how do we change the cynicism that is inherent within us and within us as a nation without turning it into some sort of nationalistic moment? How do we get to a point where we respect the U.S. Post Office, where we respect the DMV, the people that do these things? I mean, as I said, I grew up my entire life in the military, but it's not just made of fighting men and women. It's made up of postal workers, people that work in the shipyards that clean up the base, etc. Everybody's working just like everyone else, hard or not hard. They're just people. So, but how do we get to promote the effectiveness of governance, good governance,
I'm not
without
afraid
being...
to answer that question.
Go ahead.
I'm not afraid to answer that question. It's a matter of leadership. We got where we are by bad leadership, and we need to be extracted from it by good leadership. For too many years, our politicians have been telling us that, there's fraud, waste, and abuse, there's corruption, there's problems. They're supposed to be solving the problems, not just talking about the problems. We need people who can highlight the many, many, many good things that are being done by our government. Colonel Cammermeyer and I spent our entire adult lives in the government healthcare system. How's it working so far, Colonel? It's been working pretty good. I was dumbfounded when I went down to the Social Security office and I saw how great it was. The people there were phenomenal, but that's not what you hear. Same thing when I went to the DMV, phenomenal, but that's not what you hear. We need leaders at the top that talk about the great work that our government is doing, help people understand it, and then work hard to make it greater.
If I may, just a book recommendation for everyone that hasn't yet read it. Michael Lewis's The Fifth Risk. It is probably the best written thing that we will ever see of the Trump transition, what it did and didn't do with regard to capitalizing upon all of those things. But more than that, it's a summary of what the government is bringing to us and is not only not appreciated, but nobody has a clue about all of these values that are happening, that are rapidly being, in some cases, undermined, in other cases, destroyed over the last 2 years.
We've talked about some tough issues here. And, when we talk about disruption and change, it's hard, I think, in some respects, to be positive about where we're going. But leave me with some positive thoughts about our future. Grethe Cammermeyer.
I think mutual respect for how one lives in this world, how one speaks to one another, how one recognizes and appreciates the hard work that people are doing, and calling a spade, and if there is something that is not truthful, then correct it with the truth itself, and it becomes how we live our own lives with that dignity that we're looking for in others also.
Which you did. You put yourself out there. And Chirot.
Well, it's been said already before, but education, and I teach at the University of Washington, and the need for change is not at that level. I don't think the University of Washington does a bad job. The students who arrive are already shaped by their earlier education. And I think you said that we're still using the wrong methods. It's not just with computers. I think it's with subject matter, and the fundamental change which we agree we all need really starts in grade school and high school, and have people who come out knowing more. It used to be that someone like Harry Truman, who didn't go to college, had a good high school education, and he learned a lot. He learned a lot of history. It wasn't just technical stuff. And it shaped his views, and he turned out to be a much greater president than anyone had expected. And we've had other cases like that. And somehow we're not doing it now. People too often come out of high school without good educations. Some are not even fully literate. I mean, they can read and write their names and so on, but they really don't know how to read very well. They don't know how to absorb information. Too many are numerically illiterate. They haven't had enough arithmetic, much less calculus. And we have too many like that. We're failing too many people, and we're producing too many ignorant people who don't know how to learn. So education reform is critical. Paying teachers better, getting more qualified teachers, not alienating teachers who work hard and then find they don't get paid enough and have too many college loans to pay off, and so they leave. And that's small scale around the whole country, but I think it's critically important.
Dennis?
Well, it's always awkward when an environmentalist is asked for the good news. It's been suggested that we, as a breed, have a congenital aversion to good news. But in fact, that's not true. I think pretty much across the board, we believe there are solutions to all of the problems. We lose a whole lot of battles, but those were battles where we were fighting for sensible things. We know how, my little building, 50,000 square foot, not a skyscraper, 6 stories. But we tried to figure out what you could do if you wanted to build a sustainable building. So it's a building that in Seattle, the cloudiest major city in the contiguous 48 states, produces more electricity from rooftop solar panels than 6 floors of technology workers use. It captures the rain that falls on its roof and uses it not just for irrigation, but as potable drinking water. It's got its own sewage treatment plant down in the basement with composting toilets. It has ample recycling. It has nothing in it that is toxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic. And it has a good bottom line. We are operating in the black. I mean, this is stuff that we know how to do. You can apply that to transportation. What Elon Musk has done with vehicles is the beginning of a true revolution. Stuff that was just believed to be impossible 7, 8 years ago now is commonplace, and basically every automobile company in the world thinks that's where they're going to be, certainly no later than 2030. There's issue after issue after issue that is hard, but we know how to solve them all. But I think I'll go along with you in terms of leadership. This is something where if we get people who can inspire, people who can organize, people who have a vision and will draw the nation and then the planet along with it, we can get there. If I have a serious worry within this good news part, it has to do with that nationalism element. I mean, ultimately, we have to start thinking of ourselves as a species. We have to mobilize around most of these issues from, we focused a lot upon climate, but I'd apply it to machine learning and artificial intelligence and drones and mechanized warfare. And we have to start thinking of ourselves as a single species that is looking out for one another, much as we would if there were an invading force from Mars. And I hate to say that because we work best when we've got an enemy, but we've got to figure out how to come together without having had that enemy. We have to get past the sense that if somebody is born 1 inch on one side of some arbitrary line that somebody drew on a map, they are entitled to all kinds of protections and benefits, and if they're born 1 inch on the other side of that arbitrary line, they're outsiders. They get nothing. We're all people, and we need to take care of one another. I think we can get there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And with regard to leadership, you made that reference. I think without President Kennedy, we would have ended up on the moon eventually, but it would have taken a lot longer. We need leaders with vision. I'll just wrap it up with this. Right where the Colonel started, respect and dignity. We need to treat each other with respect and dignity, and we need to model that behavior ourselves at the family level, the community level, and at the level of our government. It helps, I've found, to start by assuming that not everyone who disagrees with you is a complete idiot. I found that when I use that as a starting point, I find that the people I disagree with, we have a lot more in common than I thought, and they understand a lot of these problems better than I do. And so I'm an optimist. Anybody who knows me will tell you that I'm an optimist. I'm an absolute optimist, and I'm also old enough to remember that when James Reston was a renowned columnist for the New York Times. And he wrote a column one time that was a letter to his newly born grandson. And at the end of that letter, he penned this advice to his new grandson: stick with the optimists. Things are going to be tough enough if we're right.
Please give our panel a round of applause. Thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it very much. I want to mention the fact that This is all part of the special programs that Mohai has been offering in relationship to the World War I America traveling exhibit. There will be more conversations, deep conversations. These are tough conversations to have, not easy conversations, but boy, do we need to have them. And so, I'm so appreciative that Mohai is around to let us have these conversations and to let me lead them too. I appreciate that much too. I'll leave you one last word. Rodney King, can't we just get along? All right. Thank you for being with us. Good night.